Hello and good evening and welcome to Wildlife from the Wildlife Trusts for July. And it's National Marine Week. So of course we absolutely have to have that focus for this month on the wonderful marine environment. And the question we're asking tonight is all the way downstream. We're going to be talking about the problem of pollution at sea. We want to discuss the state of our seas and marine life and also make sure that we really tap into that national celebration of all things marine that is National Marine Week. For more information, do have a look at our website, Wildlife Trust website. Tonight, we're going to be joining the dots on how our actions on land affect our marine life. Too often we talk about land and sea as if they're separate, but of course what we do on land intimately affects the marine ecosystem. And we also want to be touching on the recent devastation and the really appalling sadness that is avian flu and how that's impacting our marine seabirds. We also have a video from our ambassador, actor David Oakes, who visited the Isle of Man a few weeks ago to highlight the incredible marine work going on there by Manx Wildlife Trust. We've had a huge number of questions sent in from you in advance. I just looked just now and there was already over 90 questions before we'd even started. So we're going to try and get through as many as possible, but do put more in the chat box as we go along. Put along your comments and put your questions in, and we can have a really good discussion going on over the next 90 minutes. And I'll be reading some of your comments out as we go along as well. Now we have a brilliant panel to discuss this topic for us tonight. We're joined, I'm delighted to say, by Joe Bradley, who's Director of Operations for Stormwater Shepherds UK. We're also joined by Dr. Helen Findlay, Biological Oceanographer at Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Sophie Webster, Catch My Drift Project Officer. What a brilliant job title that is. Sophie is at Northumberland Wildlife Trust. And hopefully we're also joined by Tim Ferrero, who's a marine biologist and conservationist at Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. I say hopefully because Tim's having a few internet problems, sadly, and his connection's a bit patchy, but we're really hoping we can sort that in time so that he's able to join us. So many kind of questions to get through, but let's start first of all with you, Joe. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Joe, you've worked on many aspects of water management over 30 years of your career, 28 years, I think, at the Environment Agency, but lots of other things beyond that as well. In particular, last few years, your attention has been on pollution from urban surfaces and roads and how those can then get into watercourses and obviously ultimately into the marine environment. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Joe. Joe, can you tell us a little bit more about plastics? There's been so much attention on plastics in the last few years in the ocean. But I mean, how do plastics become a stormwater pollutant?
Thanks, Craig. So Stormwater Shepherds UK focus particularly on how plastics become a stormwater pollutant and also end up in our oceans and seas. And the culprit, if you like, is the stormwater drainage network. So across our towns and cities in the UK, we have different types of stormwater drains, and they often convey plastic litter, plastic bottles, plastic food wrappers down into rivers and streams, out into the estuaries and then out into the sea. And that's one of the focus points of Stormwater Shepherds. We try and work with local communities and local people and businesses to do litter picks and to understand that conveyance of stormwater litter into seas and oceans. But also a particular focus of mine is microplastic tire wear particles that wash out through the stormwater network whenever it rains. And they are nasty, insidious, toxic, carcinogenic pollutants. And we are just in the last couple of years even, been starting to unpick the extent of that pollution and also the toxic activity that those particles can have, the toxic impacts rather those particles can have on marine animals. It's terrifying actually. As we start to unlearn more about it, the impacts they can have and the harm they can cause is awful and huge and far-reaching. And so although plastic litter is really easy to see and everybody understands the concept of a plastic bottle washing down a stream and ending up in the sea, the microplastic pollutants are possibly more of a problem. And so Stormwater Shepherds are trying to get that recognised so that stormwater management takes the same place as wastewater management in the UK, and perhaps we could have a formal funding mechanism to improve stormwater management. We can't fix it without money, and there needs to be a proper equitable mechanism to pay for better stormwater management. So that's what we're working towards.
And so tell me, Joe, tell us a bit more about the impact that those microplastics have in the river ecosystems and then in the marine ecosystem.
I can tell you more about the river ecosystems. I'm hoping that the others in the room are better at the marine biology than I am.
I'm sure they're chipping.
I'm sure they'll chip in. But in the river ecosystem, the tire wear particles come out of the outfall when it rains. They're washed off the road surfaces. And we're talking an estimated 63,000 tonnes per annum across the UK. So what they do then is they deposit themselves, they deposit it on the riverbed at different places in the river environment, which makes it difficult to monitor. So they'll fall out when the energy in the river slows down. And so it may be 50 or 100 metres downstream of the outfall, you'll get this sedimentation. But attached to those particles, you've got toxic organic compounds like polyaromatic hydrocarbons. And within them, there are also toxic metal particulates. So that sediment in itself is toxic to the aquatic environment. And also, just recently, there's been some research carried out that's proved that the tire wear particles themselves leach out toxins that kill fish. So although we never see, or we very rarely see, fish kills downstream of a highway outfall, and so everybody says to me, well, why does it matter? Why do you spend all your life worrying about highway runoff? It's not an instant acute kill. It just has this nasty insidious effect on the reproductive capability of the organisms, the health of the organisms, their ability to grow and thrive. And that goes across the whole river ecosystem. So these toxic compounds affect the microscopic fungi. They go on then to affect the microscopic organisms, which are then the food of the insects. So the insects are deformed and undersized and fail to reproduce effectively. They're then eaten by the fish and the aquatic birds, and then it goes up the food chain. So stormwater shepherds focus on this pollution because this effect is really long term and it affects most rivers in the UK, and we just haven't done enough research. And then what it then does to go on into the marine environment, I'll leave to the marine experts to describe in more detail.
So you said there's 63,000 tonnes of just tire wear particles going into our rivers every year.
That's the estimate. It's a very difficult figure to pin down, but if you do the calculations on the amount of tire eroded off an average tire wear particles eroded off an average tire every kilometre it travels, and then you do the maths, the figure you come up with is something of the order of 63,000 tonnes. Globally, it's a phenomenal number. Now, some of those particles will go into the atmosphere and will move around in the atmosphere as particles in the air, but then they will still be redeposited somewhere else. So we find tire wear particles deposited around the road environment. So they don't just come out of the outfall, they're also deposited on the soils and in the watercourses nearby. But they're also in sewage sludge, they're in the food that we eat, they're in plastic bottles when we drink out of our plastic bottles. They're just ubiquitous, and we just haven't got a handle on it. But the frustrating thing for me, Craig, is that for road runoff, treatment of road runoff is relatively straightforward. In the UK, we have manufacturers who manufacture devices that can treat it. We also have fantastic vegetative treatment devices that can capture these microplastic particles. We have fabulous design engineers within the UK. So this is a domestic solution to a global problem that we can deliver. There's just no appetite for it at the moment. I've been trying to get people to listen for 15 years, and it's a hard slog.
Absolutely. Joe, what did you say about the vegetative solutions? What are those then?
So for road runoff particularly, or indeed any urban runoff and residential developments, you can have vegetative devices that capture stormwater. So we lovingly call them rain gardens, but there are bigger and more fancy versions than that. So there are things called swales. You can use ponds, basins, wetlands. So you run the stormwater into those devices, and they capture quite a lot of the pollution at the surface and also in the soil horizons. But they also deliver magnificent other benefits. So they reduce flood risk because they capture the water within them and hold it there for a long time. They create habitats for wildlife. And during this recent hot weather, you'll find that they create cool, damp environments for wildlife to hide from the sunshine, which is going to be increasingly important. they reduce the amount of stormwater going in the sewer, so they reduce sewer spills. And also, again, in the future, we are going to need that stormwater to give us drought resilience. So we can use that water in the garden or to water our landscapes, to wash the dog, to wash the car. And actually, ideally, we would use it to flush toilets and wash our clothes. So vegetative devices, or sustainable drainage systems, as they're often called, are a magnificent solution to this widespread problem. We just need to have them mandatory on residential developments, mandatory on commercial developments, and certainly advisory on some other developments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think many people would be surprised to hear you say that there's plastics in car tires, because most people kind of think they're rubber, but actually, of course, they're a very high proportion of plastics.
Yeah, the rubber compounds are just, they're in the mix as well, and they are also harmful. And it's frustrating because some of the tyre manufacturers are trying to find alternative products and materials to manufacture tyres out of. So, for example, they were looking at dandelion sap that also creates a rubber-like compound. But unfortunately, the pollution impacts of those compounds are very similar. So to have a sort of an adhesive, sort of sticky product that you can make tyres out of that gives you that adhesion to the road surface, you're always going to get the creation of a crumb, whatever you do. And it's that crumb that is causing the problem. And it is something that we've just never thought about. And it's something that as we peel the lid off that can of worms, it's truly horrific. And there are those that want to put the lid back, and I'm the one fighting to take the lid off. So
well, quite right too. Very well done. There's just a really important point to zoom in on here. You talk about those crumbs coming off those car tires, and you talked before about how then they have toxins on them. The point is, isn't it, that they sort of accumulate, they adhere, toxins in particular, then adhere to those crumbs, and so they accumulate around them. That's right, isn't it?
Yes. There's two things. So that, yes, certainly the toxic organic compounds adhere to those crumbs, particularly polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are very, very small, and they like to stick to something. And there's a tyre crumb, which is a perfect thing for them to stick to. But actually, as I say, it turns out that the tyre wear particles are also leaching toxins out of their own cells. So that's horrific. And as I say, the marine experts will tell us more in the next few minutes. But I have read that those tyre wear particles are found almost everywhere, and they can go through membranes between the bloodstream and organs within the bodies of marine organisms. And so the potential for them to have long-term effects is huge.
So we've inadvertently created almost like the perfect mechanism to accumulate toxins in our water environment. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It is, and unfortunately, the stormwater drainage network is the conduit that carries that harm from our road surfaces into the oceans. And we could fix it. Better stormwater management would make a massive difference. Just frustrating that we can't get the airtime that we think we deserve.
And as you say, it would have all these other so-called co-benefits, creating habitats in our urban environment, wildlife habitats, holding water back and reducing storm flows. Actually looking nice as well, and just improving the look of an area. So many other benefits, absolutely. But it's not just plastics that are pollutants. They're not the only pollutants affecting our marine environment or the river environment either, are they? There's fertilizers, pesticides, so on.
Yes, and I mean there's a huge array, and certainly agricultural runoff is up there as one of the significant causes of pollution across the UK. Completely different type of pollution, really, with the pesticides and also the organic runoff from the manures and fertilizers. But also there are things like mine water runoff, combined sewer overflows, misconnections where you connect your toilet or your drainage system into the wrong drainage network, and therefore those toilet waste and dishwasher waste, washing machine waste goes straight into the water environment. There's all sorts of things. There are industrial discharges, although I think they are less common than they used to be in the past. And there are still, admittedly rarely, but I think there are still some malicious deposits of pollutants into the water environment. That's something I saw a lot more of in the 80s, but I think it probably still happens a little bit these days. And there are just a few. I get quite cross with the definition of diffuse sources of pollution, because I don't believe that something that comes out of a pipe is a diffuse source of pollution. So highway outfalls for me point source, but there are some truly diffuse sources. So old mine workings and old landfill sites are a particular problem, and often in estuarial areas, old landfill sites just seeping pollution out sort of sneakily all the time, and they're really difficult to manage.
Yeah, sure. Well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us tonight. There's a lot more yet to discuss, but we'll move on now. But thanks very much for kicking the discussion off with, I have to say, a rather disturbing story about the microplastics that we're finding in our watercourses and how they get there. You'll remember, of course, it was just a few months ago, 9 months ago now, roughly, that we had COP26 in Glasgow. Remember that? Goodness, it seems quite a long time ago now, doesn't it? But we did at the Wildlife Trust try and put a focus at COP26 on the marine environment, and in fact on blue carbon, and actually how critically important the marine environment is to try and get in recovery to help us tackle climate change, and obviously also how the ocean ecosystems are threatened by climate change. And one of my colleagues, Lisa Bately, who's head of marine conservation at the Wildlife Trust, interviewed Dan Lafley, principal advisor to the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, on marine science and conservation, to talk about blue carbon, what it is, and how we can protect it.
So I'm here with Dan Lafley. Dan is our leading global expert on ocean conservation.
Nice to be with you. Hi.
Our oceans absorb 20 to 35% of human-made carbon dioxide every year, and we're increasingly hearing the term blue carbon. But what does this actually mean?
Blue carbon is the term that's been given to particular ecosystems under the UNFCCC, such as seagrass, mangroves, and salt marsh, that through their natural processes lay down vast amounts of carbon into the underlying sediment. And of course, this carbon is carbon that can be re-released into the atmosphere and into circulation if we don't treat these habitats in the right way. So it's really about carbon trapping ecosystems, if we can call it that.
That's great. I think one thing our listeners will be really keen to know, though, is how humans impact on blue carbon.
So if we think of mangroves, for example, it's the cutting and burning of mangroves that immediately releases carbon into the atmosphere, and then it deteriorates the carbon which was naturally stored underneath. Habitats, ecosystems like seagrass are also very vulnerable, as we've seen in various parts around the UK, to anchoring damage, but also to fishing damage.
What do we need to do to ensure that we protect and restore our blue carbon?
So one of the things that we need to do is look at where there is carbon, particularly in marine protected areas, which we've already agreed should be protected, and actually protect these areas. It's a relatively simple solution that actually satisfies several critical agendas that directly relate to this multiple crisis situation that humanity finds itself in.
But how can fishing and wider marine spatial planning, how we use our marine space as a whole, contribute towards protecting and enhancing those stores?
I think the trick is a combination of putting in place as a widespread measure highly protected marine protected areas, and then putting them into the planning process so we know where they are, so we don't put activities on top that will damage them, and also taking measures in the fishing industry to avoid trawling in marine protected areas. So there's a combination of mechanisms we need to look at, and no single measure is going to help turn that corner and get us out the mess we're in. But together, I think we stand a good chance of being able to properly manage biodiversity, properly manage carbon services that nature provides for us in the ocean, and therefore make a major contribution to turning the corner to a brighter, more hopeful future.
Always great to end on a positive. So thank you ever so much for your time today, Dan. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
A pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
So my thanks there to my colleague, Dr. Lisa Bately, who's head of marine conservation at the Wildlife Trust, for that great interview with Dan Lafley. Hope you found that interesting. Our next guest tonight is Dr. Helen Findlay, who's a biological oceanographer at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Helen has been particularly interested in understanding the effects of climate change on ocean acidification, on marine ecosystems, and the application of this knowledge to maintain a healthy and sustainable ocean, with a particular focus on the Arctic. Good evening, Helen. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, good evening, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you about climate change, oceanification, and other pollutants.
Yeah, well, it's great to have you. So, particularly during National Marine Week, tell us a bit more about your research and your findings on acidification and climate change.
Yeah, so I've been researching ocean acidification for over 15 years now, since its infancy, really, when we started thinking about how the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was interacting with the oceans. I guess just so we're on the same page with ocean acidification, just so we're all there, ocean acidification is when carbon dioxide is taken up into the ocean. It reacts with the water and forms a weak acid, and that results in the oceans becoming more acidic. So my role is to really understand what that means in terms of the chemistry. I sit on the fence a little bit between the biology and the chemistry. I'm trying to understand how the ocean is changing, that chemistry is changing, but also what it means for the organisms that live in the ocean. So any of the plants and animals and the habitats that are there. So we've been running experiments in the laboratory to try and understand what future scenarios might look like, how organisms respond, but also looking at whether we can see impacts in the field, and how we can tease apart the impacts of climate change and other stresses on these marine organisms. It's a very complicated environment with lots of things going on. And so we're trying to really understand the nitty-gritty of what's causing changes in various systems.
Okay, thank you. So tell us a bit more about what's the combination of human activities that are affecting this. I mean, obviously, burning fossil fuels drives climate change and so on, but there's a lot of factors coming together here, aren't there?
Yeah, particularly in the coastal regions, it's a very complicated environment. So the main driver of what we think of as open ocean acidification is this carbon dioxide driving this acidity change, this change in the carbonate system. But in the coastal systems, it's incredibly complex, and what we have is we have a mix of things like the river influence, land influence coming in, that can bring in this fresh water, for instance, from rivers, that can also impact on the chemistry of the ocean. And we also have many of these other pollutants that we think of, the nutrient runoffs from agriculture, the plastic pollution not so much directly affects these organisms, but these different stresses can actually interact with the chemistry and alter the way that the organisms can respond to that. So if we think just about fresh water, for instance, if fresh water has a pH of around about 7 usually, whereas seawater generally is around about 8.1 or so. If we mix those two together, then we'd expect to get a kind of enhanced acidification. So in the coastal regions, what we find is that there's some areas near rivers, for instance, that potentially have enhanced acidification rates, and that's of particular concern. But then there's other areas where maybe it's less of a stress. There's maybe lots of plants there that are photosynthesizing. If you photosynthesize, you take up that carbon dioxide from the water, from the air, and that actually can ameliorate, it can and help the general ocean acidification trend. So what we're trying to do is really understand the dynamics of that system and look at where maybe is places around our coast that need some other management strategies to be put in place to allow us to kind of think about maybe these nutrient runoffs that are coming in, or if there's other systems that we can manage that will help us generally allow the systems to be more resilient to these bigger stresses like the climate change and the acidification stresses that we have a little bit less control over, if you like. It takes that bigger motivation, that bigger impact to reduce emissions and to reduce the carbon content. But there are other things that we can look at to really help that acidification stress.
And it's obviously just one of the many stresses on, for example, the Arctic ecosystem. You must see these kind of, tell us a bit more how these different stresses conspire together almost, shrinking ice cap, warmer weather, all of these things happening together.
Yeah, so if we think of the Arctic Ocean, it's a complicated system. So far, I guess we've been thinking about maybe around the UK coast in terms of just these freshwater systems or river runoffs. The Arctic is a special case in the fact that it's essentially an ocean that's surrounded by land. So it has about 1% of the ocean's rivers coming into it, but it has a huge amount of freshwater influence. Then, of course, we've got the sea ice formation and retreat every year. So you have melting and forming of ice as you go through the seasons, through spring and summer, and then retreat, growing again into winter. And that changes the chemistry as well. So the seawater, as it freezes, actually releases carbon into the seawater above it. So it essentially kind of extrudes out that carbon, if you like, from the seawater. I don't know if anyone ever watched the Blue Planet documentaries where they went to Antarctic and there was these brine channels of ice, and you could see the salty water coming down from the ice as the ice froze. Well, that salty water, that incredibly salty water, is taking carbon out of the atmosphere, out of that surface water, sea ice as it freezes, and taking it down into the deep ocean. And so we have a lot of chemical changes going on underneath the ice, around the ice, and combining that with the fact that you've got all this freshwater influence, as well as highly dynamic seasons, because you have this huge light day night cycle through the year. In the summertime, it's full 24-hour daylight. In the wintertime, you've got 24-hour darkness. And so you have extremes of these seasonal dynamics in terms of plant growth and photosynthesis in the seawater, and all of that conspires together to make a system that is ripe for being incredibly impacted by climate change and acidification.
Great, Helen. It is a very complex picture, isn't it? How all these different issues interact, and too often we perhaps talk about these issues in isolation, one by one. But the real concern is how they all conspire and work together to cause such a negative impact on the ocean environment. Well, look, Helen, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and looking forward to getting into the discussion a bit later. But you've kicked us off very well there in telling us about your background. Thank you very much. So we want to have a short message now from our president of the Wildlife Trust, who's wildlife presenter Liz Bonin, and our ambassador Sophie Pavel, on how you can get involved with National Marine Week.
It's National Marine Week, time to celebrate our incredible seas and all the very special wildlife they're home to with the Wildlife Trust. Now, I'm lucky enough to be on the coast today, and there is nothing I love more than listening to the sound of the waves and letting the ocean work its magic. If you can, head to your local coastline this week and breathe in that fresh sea air. But even if you don't live near the sea, you can still get involved. Here's Sophie Pavel to tell you how.
The Wildlife Trust have lots of resources on their website, including ways that you can help our seas no matter where you live. Everything you wash down the sink could eventually make its way to the sea, so make sure you're using eco-friendly products, and a litter pick is a great way of making sure that harmful litter doesn't make its way into our waters where it can harm wildlife. And you can do it wherever you are on your way to and from places. In fact, I'm going to do a quick one now before I head home.
So that was Liz Bonin, our president, and Sophie Pavel, our ambassador there, telling you how you can get involved in National Marine Week. So next up is Sophie Webster, who's the Catch My Drift project officer at Northumberland Wildlife Trust. What a brilliant job title that is, Sophie. Thanks so much for joining us today, and nice to see you again. I saw you last when we were on that beach when Liz was recording that piece, wasn't it? And that's up at beautiful Druridge Bay, right where you are.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. It's a bit of a different story up in Northumberland on the coast at the moment.
Yes, well, of course, we really want you to tell us about that. I mean, it's an absolute tragedy what's happening at the moment. It's the appalling impact of avian flu, isn't it? Tell us about the impact that's having.
So we're kind of seeing it all over the country, but obviously my first-hand account in Northumberland, we're massively seeing it in our breeding seabird colonies. So I think a couple of days ago, there was a big news article about the devastating impacts it's had on the Farne Islands with their terns and their puffins and kittiwakes. But where I work on George Bay, it's a little bit further south and about 1.2 kilometres off the shores of an island called Coquet. And that is the UK's only roseate tern colony. And they've had an absolutely devastating impact. And I've met with the warden several times because their terns tend to come into our reserves to bathe in fresh water. And what we're seeing there is they've pretty much been wiped out of sandwich tern chicks. I think they told me earlier on in the week it was about 2,500 sandwich tern chicks had succumbed to avian flu since it started. And basically their roseate terns as well, they had about 85 adults and half of their chick population has kind of gone. So it's impacting these densely nesting birds that seem to have a high mix rate. On Coquet, they haven't seen it as badly in puffins and in kittiwakes. They seem to be slightly more spread out, with the puffins being in burrows, so they're not interacting as much. So it really seems to have hit the terns in Northumberland more so than anything else.
It is absolutely horrific what's happening there, and it just sort of seems to be spreading to more and more of the country at the moment. Sophie, is there any sense as to how this started?
It's a bit of an unusual one. We first got our main report in June of 16 dead gannets washed up on the beach where you just saw Liz. And it was confirmed that they had bird flu, and it kind of just trickled out a little bit over the coming weeks. And then it just seems to have just hit us so badly and so quickly as well. So I'm not entirely personally sure how or where it's kind of come from in that respect. I know earlier in the year, there was a big strain on more poultry than it was wild birds. So how it's made that leap, or if it's a different strain, is something altogether. But we went from, say, 2 dead birds reported on our main reserve on George Bay to 50 on the Monday, to 3 times that amount by the middle of the week. And it just seems to have exploded so quickly. And we had such a huge impact. And because of that nearby Coquet Island kind of tern colony, they come into our reserves to kind of bathe in the fresh water. But what they were now coming to do is coming over here and unfortunately dying on our reserves. And it's been horrific to see. And 2 of my colleagues have been PPE'd out with DEFRA approved, all their PPE equipment. And they collected 400 birds in 2 weeks on 2 of our nature reserves out of 6 that we have across the whole of George Bay. And they're just the ones coming in off the sea. They're not even the ones that we're seeing on the islands and on the beaches as well. So to kind of think how far it's spread across the country is quite staggering.
It's devastating, and it will take many years for those populations to recover, won't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, none of us are in conservation to kind of see these birds or any animal kind of die in front of your eyes. And it's been quite a tough one on everybody. I mean, I've only worked in conservation for 3 years, but those 3 years have been hard work on George Bay, and to kind of walk along your site and it's kind of littered with these dead birds or the dying birds. And I mean, it's horrific watching them. It seems to attack their cerebral functions, so they're kind of all over the place. And it's not just me, like I said, my colleagues who are actually having to collect these, it's having a huge impact on them. Again, they've worked on these sites for 20 years or so, and having to kind of be picking up all these birds day after day is having a huge toll. We have volunteers come out with us a lot doing bird counts, and we've had a lot of them almost in tears. That's what they do on their days off. They come out and they sit and they count birds and give us species list, and they're sitting there in one hide and watching 5 terns die in front of them. It's been quite really hard on people who we obviously care so much about these birds, and there's nothing you can really do to, once it gets a hold, it's there.
Yeah, it must be absolutely heartbreaking. Very hard for you to be doing that. And but thank you so much to you and your colleagues for what you are doing. It's such an essential job at this time. What's the advice you give to sort of members of the public? You know, if they're going on the beach, they come across birds in this kind of state, what would be your advice?
So we're just telling everybody to follow the DEFRA guidelines, which is if you suspect a dead bird or an ill bird has bird flu, to call their helpline, and to not touch or approach or pick up dead or injured seabirds. So unfortunately, we have a lot of very well-meaning members of the public, particularly at the start of this kind of outbreak, who kept trying to bring us injured gannets and things that they'd found washed up on the beach. And we're kind of like, we understand where they're coming from, and it's been very difficult message to kind of get out there, it seems, or at least for us up in Northumberland, that it's remained out of the news up until recently with the Farne Islands. So yeah, we're just trying to reiterate that message, is to just report them and leave them alone, because there's always that possibility of animal-human transmission.
It's quite shocking. And I understand David Williams has asked the question, what's also happening on the northeast coast with the mass dying of crustaceans? This has had a bit of publicity as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. I'm not a big marine person. I'm just working on the coast, but there's been a lot going on in our whole ocean systems, as people have touched on. And we've noticed a lot with the recent heat waves as well, seems to be massively impacting our intertidal species.
Yeah, all of this a sign of an ecosystem really under stress. And I apologise for all the sort of depressing news so far tonight, but we'll do that, and we'll try and talk about some of the solutions. We'll get on to that in a little while. But I mean, it is our job at the Wildlife Trust to tell the truth about what's going on. And sadly, the truth isn't too good at the moment about the state of our marine ecosystems. Anyway, Sophie, thank you so much for that, and we'll be coming back to you in the discussion a little later on. So we also now want to hear from actor and ambassador for the Wildlife Trust, David Oakes. He visited Isle of Man a few weeks ago to meet with Lee Morris, Chief Executive of Manx Wildlife Trust, to hear about the incredible marine work that's happening on the island with Manx Wildlife Trust, and particularly ranging from their seagrass projects and ambitions for the future.
My name is David Oakes, and I am an actor, environmentalist, and an ambassador for the Wildlife Trusts. And I am out on a windy day on the Isle of Man, standing precariously on a cliffside to talk to Lee Morris, the Chief Executive of the Manx Wildlife Trust. Hello, Lee.
Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Isle of Man.
It's good to be here. We've got some seals over there, over my right shoulder. So where are we? Where am I standing?
We are at the southern tip of the Isle of Man. This is the Calf Sound behind us.
So what's going on here? What projects have you got working on this part of the island?
Well, the first thing with the Calf of Man is where the bird observatory is. In Manx Wildlife Trust, we've got a team of wardens on the Calf who are doing really important work in terms of surveying birds, but also in conservation projects in bringing some really important bird species back to the island.
And one of the new projects you've started over the last year is getting the MOTUS scheme going here, so you can keep a track of the birds coming and going and seeing what they're doing.
So the MOTUS tracking system used actually all around the world, but we don't know of any receiver in the Irish Sea, bizarrely. So we're going to put a MOTUS, and that will immediately allow us to start hopefully tracking birds that have already got pingers on them, and then we're looking to start adding our own tags to birds that we net in the calf that we can start to monitor. And the first one on the list is actually wheatears.
Okay.
Wheatears and blackcaps were the first two targets, but the potential in terms of where we are in the Irish Sea for some of the seabirds, the big seabirds, maybe it's great blackback gulls, cormorant movements, we can actually then start to track how those birds move around. And we're hoping we might inspire England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, Republic of Ireland, to also start putting MOTUS receivers around the Irish Sea.
That'd be amazing. Track everything as it goes all the way around. So, Lee, we've come up the east coast of the island a little bit, up from the Calf. Where are we now?
We're now on Fort Island, which is a tiny little islet joined on by a causeway over there to the Langness Peninsula, which is an ASSI, an Area of Special Scientific Interest. And behind us is the beautiful Derby Haven Bay. There was rumours of seagrass in Derby Haven Bay. We've found 5 different patches of seagrass out here now, but I don't think we've got halfway across the bay. And it's such an important project for the island now in terms of our blue carbon.
For those that don't know, what's so important about seagrass and kelp and the like?
Seagrass, it's the only true plant that lives under the water, flowering plant. It's really important for carbon sequestration. It's also really important as a habitat for biodiversity. So it's a nursery ground. You get all sorts of critters and things that live in there. So it's not currently designated a seagrass area. I think one of the things that we want to do as a wildlife trust that I'm keen to see that we do is that we get those accurate plots of where the seagrass beds are, and then we can give that information into the Isle of Man government and look to get this as a designated area of seagrass, which will then have a higher level of protection.
One of the things you mentioned very briefly was blue carbon. Can you explain what that is in more depth?
We want to sequester carbon, we want to lock carbon up to mitigate against climate change. Seagrass is one form of blue carbon. You know, the seagrass itself, the detritus and everything else that builds up in the rooting zone around the rhizomes will lock carbon up for a long time. And then beyond that, you've got the blue carbon that's just in the seabed, you know, all those millions of years of life where carbon has just fallen onto the floor of the sea. It's held in there and it builds up.
As well as just being a good way to sequester carbon, there's also methane deposits that are kept down by dense layers of vegetation, and not to mention even the photosynthesis that a lot of algae and seagrasses actually do to create oxygen for the planet. As the Manx Wildlife Trust, how much of your focus is on the island and how much of your focus is around the island?
Actually, the bulk of the Isle of Man's, if you like, property is in the marine environment that surrounds it. And we're also a complete whole nation, so we can work with the marine department at our government. But, you know, we're a small island. How does that influence the big world? Well, I've been really excited since I joined the Wildlife Trust a couple and a half years ago that synchronicity is that there's now a conversation and an Irish Sea group. So England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, both islands with us are now at the table talking about the Irish Sea in a strategic way about, we're not suddenly going to change the world, but we are sharing issues, and even to know that the same issues around seagrass or industrialisation or climate change, because we all care about the birds and the basking sharks and the fish, and if we can share a little bit of that, and then maybe we're now to the next level where we're coming out with a joint vision for the Irish Sea. We want to be absolutely about the Isle of Man, but we don't want to be insular. We've got an important role to play in the British Isles.
Isn't that great? That was David Oakes, actor and ambassador for the Wildlife Trust in the Isle of Man, speaking to Lee Morris, Chief Executive of Manx Wildlife Trust, hearing about the brilliant work they do at Manx Wildlife Trust. Now, there's been a lot of interest tonight, a lot of comments coming in. Thank you very much. Keep them coming in. We've had lots of hellos from Falmouth Marine Conservation Group. Hello, Falmouth. Also from the most southerly part of the UK, from the Lizard in Cornwall. That's One Bag Beach Clean. Hello, good evening. Hope you're enjoying it. Interesting comment from Rob Barlow, said we have seen this problem with microplastics in Antarctica this year. Sounds like Rob's got direct experience of that. Maybe tell us in the chat, Rob, what your direct experience of that is, please. I'd love to know a little bit more. Graham Warner says an important point. We keep talking about cleaner energy cars such as electric vehicles, but the answer has to be fewer cars, not more different cars. Quite right, Graham. You know, even from a carbon point of view, it's estimated that to reach our carbon targets, we have to reduce the number of cars on the road by 20%, even if they all went electric, let alone talking about the issue we're talking about tonight, microplastics as well. So you're absolutely right. Electric vehicles, big role to play, but they're no panacea for sure. Ian Townsend has said pharmaceuticals and vet medicines too, they are also a form of pollutant in our rivers and watercourses. Absolutely right, Ian. Not least neonicotinoids put on pets as well. And when dogs swim through rivers, often those wash off and obviously pollute the watercourses with that as well. Fascinating comment. You'll find this really interesting, Joe. Another Joe, but Joe Rose. Said he's a relatively new planner, and he said this is the first time he's ever heard of tyre pollution. Said it's very interesting. I shall keep this in mind. Not something I've ever thought of. He can find out a lot more at your website, can't he, Joe? The Stormwater Shepherds UK website. I think you'd find out a lot more there, Joe Rose. You'd find that really interesting. East Dorset Friends of the Earth. Hello, East Dorset Friends of the Earth. Nice to hear from you. Litter on the beaches is a serious problem around here, as it's a very popular UK holiday destination. Yeah, of course. So keep those comments coming in and questions coming in. We'll get to as many as we can. Now we're going to try now to hear from my colleague Tim Ferrero, who's marine biologist and conservationist at the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. Tim has had some internet problems tonight, but we really want to hear from him. And so we've told him to turn his camera off. He's a lovely guy, lovely looking guy, but we've told him to turn his camera off to try and improve the sound quality. And hopefully you'll then be able to hear him talk to us about the role of seagrass, because Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust are doing some phenomenal work around trying to restore seagrass. So Tim, do tell us more. Why is seagrass so fantastic?
Well, hi. I hope you can hear me okay. And certainly, yes, I guess the longest in the tooth of all these people here. I think one little bit of good news is that I started out in many years ago, and at least those two respects, there's a couple of points now much reduced than they were. We have needs that have come on to replacement. But in our work in Stormwater, we are looking at seagrass, of course, the only marine flowering plant. We have two species, the dwarf seagrass, eelgrass, and the whole of the UK, the whole of the North Atlantic, our seagrass meadows are a relic habitat. 10% of what we 100 years ago, when they waste diseases, slide labyrinthiozospori, tore through seagrass habitats right across the North Atlantic and pretty much wiped them out. Again, seagrass incredibly important habitat. They modify the seabed, change a muddy, sandy, or excellent seabed into a vegetated, more complex environment. So they're fantastic for supporting biodiversity. They support species of commercial importance as well, like cod, cuttlefish, scallops, you name it. And they also have an incredible role at the blue carbon habitat, because not just the leaves, of course, plants, they photosynthesize. They
Tim, I'm sorry, I think I'm being told that the
But
sound is just... Tim, I'm sorry, the sound is just not good enough, I'm afraid. We're losing you quite a lot, so it's very hard to hear you. We might try again in a bit, but I think it's going to prove really hard to hear you. It's a real shame, because at Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, you are doing some phenomenal work on trying to restore seagrass habitats. We know that seagrass habitats are incredibly important marine habitats in their own right, and not least nursery areas for fish, but they also are brilliant at sucking up carbon and storing carbon. So that's going to be a really important role that seagrass meadows can play, and important to get them restored. There are some challenges there, because it's actually pollution impacts on seagrass habitat. So we have to make sure that we can reduce the pollution going into our seas and to our coasts if we're going to have a better chance of restoring seagrass habitats as well. But if we can do that, it would make a huge difference. What we will do is we'll put some links in the chat to the brilliant work that Tim and his team are doing in Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust, so you can find out more about that seagrass project. We'll try and get Tim back a bit later, but I think it's going to be hard and unlikely, unfortunately. Just his internet connection is just not strong enough. So I'm sorry about that. We'll see where we get to, but for now, let's do one of those things we do on Wildlife that we know you love, which are the polls, the audience polls. And we want to test your knowledge here a little bit. So the question we're going to put in the poll now is approximately how much of the Earth's oxygen comes from the ocean, do you think? How much of the Earth's oxygen comes from the ocean? Is it A, less than 10%? Is it B, more than 25%? Or is it C, over 50%? So just have a think about that and let us know what you think. Approximately how much of the Earth's oxygen comes from the ocean? Is it less than 10%? Is it B, more than 25%, or is it over 50%? That will be appearing in the chat very shortly, if it hasn't done so already. and we'd love to make sure you can tell us which one you think. We'll give the answers to you shortly and see what you think. Loads of questions and comments coming in all night, of course. Particular question from Stephen Ball that I want to put to all the panelists tonight. Stephen Ball has asked, and it's one of those questions that actually, if I'm on a panel, I hate this kind of question. So I'm sorry, I'm just going to, I'm getting revenge maybe, I don't know. Stephen asks, what's the single most important thing that we as individuals can do, as well as industry and institutions, to prevent polluting our seas? So who wants to kick off? We know this is not a single thing, but it'd still be interesting as a way of having the conversation. Helen, do you want to kick us off, please? What would you say?
Okay, yeah, it's one of those tricky ones, isn't it? I would say that being mindful and conscious of the things that you buy and their life cycle is probably one of the best things that you can do, because if you are aware of where you're getting things and their kind of their life cycle, what their end life looks like, end of life, what you're going to do with it at the end, then that goes a long way to helping a lot of these issues. It helps when you think about the carbon emissions cost. It helps when you think about the pollutants. It helps when you think about recycling and reusing products. So I think just being mindful and aware of where you get your products and the things that you buy and wear.
Great, thank you, Helen. Joe, what about you? What would you say?
On the back of that, I think certainly buying local produce from local agricultural produce is good. But actually, what I'm going to say is using less water. We're about to go potentially into a drought in this country again. We nearly had one 2 years ago in the northwest of England. They're going to become more common, and if we use less water in the home, that has all sorts of benefits for using less carbon in the water industry, but also it produces less sewage. So the less sewage we produce, the less likelihood there is of the sewers overflowing into the river and into the aquatic environment. So we reduce pollution. And somebody in the chat you mentioned before talked about pharmaceutical products and all the emerging chemicals that we're finding coming out of our homes, washing the stuff we put in our washing machines, the stuff we use in our dishwashers, the medications that we take. If we reduce the amount of water we use, then that reduces the risk of that getting into the water environment without first having treatment. So a bit of a swerve ball, but reduce your water consumption.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Sophie?
Kind of jumping on the back of both of those is being more mindful of what you're buying and where from, but also trying to encourage more environmental farming practices. So one of the things in my job is to try and reduce the phosphate levels in our 2 water bodies. Through kind of trying to encourage and work with farmers on reducing their fertilizers that they're putting on, creating wildflower meadows and reed beds, just to try and diffuse that's coming in. As we're seeing huge amounts of issues with our water bodies now. So yeah, just kind of support sustainable farming.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a question from Mandy Keane. It says, how will you get the government to engage actively in these issues? So quite a big question, but I suppose we should just explore this a little bit, because of course, you know, there's no constituency at sea, is there? There's not you don't have an electorate in the marine environment. You don't have voters in the marine environment. You don't even have constituencies or members of parliament, sadly, for particular parts of the ocean around the UK. Does that cause a real problem? How have you all found, how easy is it to engage members of parliament and government in these kind of issues? I mean, Joe, let's start with you. You were really talking in your opening presentation. You know, you made it very clear your big frustration sometimes at how hard it's been to really kind of get people to listen to really just how serious these issues are.
Yeah, it is. It has been. What's slightly frustrating is that it's become a really highly talked about topic in the last 18 months, particularly because a gentleman called Fergal Sharkey, who's famous, suddenly got it. You know, he like some of the people on the call today heard about these pollutants and was horrified and started talking about them and tweeting about them and encouraging people to get engaged in the topic. And to be frank, from there, the topic has massively raised up amongst people what people talk about. MPs are talking about this, local councils are talking about it. It's been discussed in the Environmental Audit Committee extensively. There have been recommendations from the Audit Committee to government for reducing pollution of aquatic environments, particularly from sewage. I'm afraid sewage still takes the pole position, and stormwater drainage lags behind somewhat. But certainly, if you can find a celebrity, that helps. And also, the great British public are brilliant at taking care of the local environment and being concerned about their local environment. And during lockdown, we saw a massive increase in litter picking, to the point that some towns and cities in this country now, people are sort of falling out about who gets to pick the litter. So that's something as well that we can build on, that energy in our local communities, beach cleaning, 2-minute beach cleans, which has become a common activity, and litter picking in towns and cities. If we can brigade that energy and use it to take this topic forward, get people to speak to their MPs, get local schools involved, it just raises the profile. And I think that's the best way to do this. I don't think political lobbying is necessarily the best way. I think it's getting that public concern and that public energy, and potentially a celebrity if possible, to get the voice, strength of voices heard so that everybody's talking about it.
Sophie, is that your sense of it as well?
Yeah, it is. So a big part of my job is actually working with members of the public in areas that may not have a huge environmental awareness. So just trying to get them in and really get engaged, and starting from a young age as well. Just they're the people who in the end are going to start and make the decisions for us. So I always try and aim a lot of activities for younger members.
Absolutely. Helen, what are your thoughts on this? You follow these issues closely. You obviously do quite a lot of expert briefings. Do you feel you're listened to?
I think generally the message is getting out there. It is a real challenge and a struggle, and these things take a lot of time, which is something we don't really have, especially when, as Joe mentioned and Sophie, these events are becoming more frequent. There's extreme events that are going to happen more rapidly, and we need to be getting the message out there quickly. So the traditional academic route, which I guess I class myself as a traditional academic, is really just to write the scientific papers and then kind of hope that it gets taken up by policy reports and the general public. But I think more and more so we're outward looking, and especially here at PML, we have a very big impacts program where we have people, including myself, who will go out and try to interact with some of the policymakers. We invite our local MPs to PML and to Plymouth and to experience and hear about the research that we're doing. We go to the COP events. So I was at COP26. We'll be going again to COP27. And I think it's through those sort of interactions that you get with policymakers where you can start to make a bit of ground, really, providing them with the evidence that they need to then put forward into kind of to make these laws and legislations happen. So in a way, it's knowing the right routes to get there. And I totally agree with Joe and the others that it's really about the public awareness as well, and making sure that people feel some ownership to the marine environment. And we're a UK nation, it's an island nation. I think it's something like no one's further than 80 kilometers from the sea. So it should be everyone's right to be able to access that. And I'm a strong advocate and believer for ocean literacy, and we've been working with people like the National Marine Aquarium to make sure that we try and engage and produce resources for schools as well. So it's working at all those levels, I think, is the best way to really get those issues to light.
Great. Well, thank you very much there. Now, there's lots of you making lots of suggestions in the chat tonight about how people can help on these issues. Thank you very much for that, and keep those coming. That's really kind of welcome. A short while ago, we put a poll to you. We asked approximately how much of the Earth's oxygen comes from the ocean, and one of them, A, was less than 10%. Well, none of you chose that, so that's good. You're an educated lot joining us tonight. 23% of you thought more than 25%. I mean, well, you're kind of right in one sense, but actually the correct answer was C. Over 50%, over half of the Earth's oxygen comes from the ocean, and 77% of you got that right. As I said, a nicely well-educated bunch joining us tonight. You know your ocean statistics, I think. So thanks very much for that. We had a question from Lynn Power, which I think is an important one because we've had a lot of the conversations we've had tonight have been quite depressing. But Lynn Power's question, are there any initiatives that are actually having positive results over recent years? What do you see that's happening that is actually working and having a good result on any of these issues? Helen?
So I think we have a lot of successes in terms of trying to reduce the nutrient inputs into rivers and that influence on eutrophication events. From my research, that affects acidification levels. And if you look across Europe, the North Sea and the English Channel, for example, where we've been able to actually implement some of the legislation for changing the nutrient inputs into rivers, as well as things like the shipping industry capping sulfates, nitrates off shipping industry with the new polar shipping regulations. Those sort of regulations are having a positive impact in terms of reducing the amount of those sort of gaseous pollutions coming into the marine environment. Certainly from my perspective of seeing that in terms of changing chemistry. So I think that's a positive thing. And I think what we need to be doing is keeping on top of that reporting, keeping reporting to the UK government, keeping reporting to things like the OSPAR Convention, and making sure that the monitoring is ongoing to show that those types of legislation do work when they're implemented correctly. And working with marine resource managers to think about climate smart marine spatial planning is kind of a term that's starting to be bandied around a little bit, is where we use our knowledge of the climate change issues together with these other issues to really think about the best places to put marine activities and to use the marine resources sustainably. I feel quite positive about those sort of actions. I think we will be making progress with those in the next coming years.
Yeah, well, I very much hope so. Joe, what about you? What do you think there's any initiatives having positive results in recent years?
Yeah, I think Wales, we have to give a shout out to Wales because in Wales, they enacted a part of the Floods and Water Management Act, which means that sustainable drainage systems are mandated on new developments and have been for about 3 years. So they're starting to see, well, they are seeing good sustainable drainage systems on most developments where the stormwater is captured, reused. They've got beautiful rain gardens and mature trees in their urban centres. They've got cycle lanes delineated by flower beds. They've got some really good SUDS examples. And the good thing about that is that Wales went first and did a brilliant job of it. And so now in England, it looks as if we will get that schedule enacted in England, hopefully in the next 12 to 18 months, and we'll start to see more sustainable drainage systems. So there are always good things, little glimmers of hope. The difficulty for me is they're not fast enough. So we could have a deposit return scheme where you get money back when you put your plastic bottles and glass bottles into a deposit vessel. They've been talking about that. Scotland are going ahead with that, but not until August 2023. England aren't going ahead with that yet, and there's no, although it's likely to go ahead, there's no commitment that it will happen, and it's so frustrating because there are great nuggets out there, but I just wish they'd be delivered more quickly.
It does seem to be a trick of government, doesn't it, to announce a big thing when, like the deposit return scheme, when actually they're just announcing the start of a consultation. And then in that case, it's what, 4 or 5 years since they launched that consultation on a deposit return scheme, and we still haven't seen it.
Yeah, and if you look at the data, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's millions of plastic bottles, every year going into the ocean from terrestrial sources across the UK. And if we'd have had a deposit return scheme 3 years ago, how many millions of bottles would that have taken out of the ocean? Yeah. Such a shame it's taking too long.
It's astonishing, isn't it? Incredibly slow as a sea snail or something. So
I should maybe give a shout out to Tim here in the fact that the seagrass restoration projects have been a really positive thing, I think, just to kind of allow him to kind of get his say in without being here, in the fact that these Remedies project and the projects associated with seagrass replantation is, I think, another really good example of biodiversity reintroduction, and hopefully will help the marine environment as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that's come in that something we haven't talked about yet, but Mary Thornton has asked the question: how much recognition does underwater noise pollution get? This is a big issue, isn't it, Helen?
It is, yeah. It's not something I particularly know a huge amount about. I have colleagues that work on noise and soundscape of the oceans, which is incredibly interesting and wonderful to hear some of the examples of the sounds that they hear. But it is a big issue, and it can be devastating for some of the marine mammals and things that use sonar, for example. But even just a lot of the organisms that we don't necessarily think about as having kind of that sound as an important aspect of their lives do use sound. So fish species, if you listen to some of the fish on reefs, even the kind of rocky reefs that we have around the UK, make clicking noises and sounds, and engines and things can definitely interfere with that. So it is a significant issue. And while we're on the topic of kind of pollutions that we don't necessarily think about, the other one perhaps that people are not aware of as much, but is becoming much more of a research topic anyway, is the artificial light pollution. So along all our coasts, we obviously have light that we want on land to light our nights with, but actually that has significant consequences for the marine organisms that live both in the intertidal and the subtidal zones as well.
Absolutely. There's a lot of comments coming in here about following our discussion. We were talking earlier about MPs and so on. Mark Winslow has said, several letters to my MP, only 30% acknowledged or responded to. I have not had an MP for 6 months now. Interesting. Sheena said we have a really active litter picking group in our town. I was struck, Joe. I couldn't believe what you were saying, Joe, that some places people are almost fighting over who to do the litter picking.
The funny thing is we sometimes organise litter picks with our ambassadors, the Stormwater Shepherds ambassadors, and we did one yesterday in Wigan in Lancashire, which was brilliant. The primary school children came along and we had great fun, but we had to speak to the local litter picking group first to ask them not to litter pick for a week or 10 days beforehand, or else there would have been no litter left for the children. And it's got to that extent in some towns that the litter picking is so good, it's getting almost too good.
I remember, I'm old enough to remember Margaret Thatcher doing a photo op in the 1980s about litter, and they had to throw a load of litter around a London square first so that she could come and pick up a few pieces. Anyway, Graham Warnell has said, put a big tax on bottled water. The extraction is environmentally damaging, and UK tap water is perfectly drinkable. Will reduce plastic waste as well. And Bill Foe has said, Walsall Wombles do a lot of litter picking. Over 200 people involved. There you go. They're big on litter picking here. One Bag Beach Clean has said, beach cleans and litter picks are great for raising awareness. I have more and more people joining in. Ian Townsend has made a point in response to that question earlier about what kind of gives us hope. Ian Townsend said, citizen science initiatives are a growing environmental success story, really beginning to help improve our understanding of water quality, for example. Sophie, you were saying obviously a lot of your job is engaging people along the coast. To what extent are you involved in sort of citizen science projects as such, or is it more sort of just engaging and explaining some of the science and what's going on and how we can celebrate the marine environment?
No, I actually do quite a lot of citizen science projects. So my job's, I've got many hats in my job. And along with working with communities, I also work with volunteers, and may not all be marine based, but we do take on a lot of the citizen science projects to train our volunteers up in simple survey methods that they can use when out on any of our reserves, but also when they go home. So yeah, we really try and plug citizen science, and I think it's a great thing for people to get involved in. And I think sometimes people just need that confidence to get started, and then once they're away, that's brilliant.
It really can be sort of a very empowering form of taking action, can't it? But is the data from it, is that useful as well? Can come together? Are you finding that's actually sort of you're able to use that to help shape work and ways to impact on these issues?
Yeah, it definitely helps. Obviously, we like all data, it kind of has its statistics linked to it. But yeah, it does help us, especially when it's kind of coming to, we do a lot of freshwater sampling. So even if they can just kind of get it down to certain groups, it kind of gives us an idea of what species are present. So it does help us massively and inform. And then if we feel like a situation might need a bit more understanding, then we'll bring in more local experts. But I also make sure that my volunteers get to go along with them as well. So they're always learning these skills, kind of taking it from citizen science. And if we need to investigate more, kind of ushering them along with some of the experts.
Yeah, great. Joe, I mean, do you find that there's citizen science, is that helping at all at the moment over, looking at stormwater flows and so on in the more urban environment?
Yeah, there's a couple of things we've got citizen scientists doing, and they are brilliant. One of them is just visuals. So if they know where there's an outfall from a highway outfall or a sewer overflow or an industrial outfall, we ask them to just look at it and tell us when it's causing a problem, perhaps take photographs and videos, because that's really valuable. But there are also citizen scientists working with the rivers trusts, and stormwater shepherds do a little bit of that work with them, and that's measuring insects, as Sophie's just talked about, in the aquatic environment. And that's brilliant, because once people realise that there are little biddies in the river and they start to learn the different species names, the freshwater shrimps and the caddisflies, and the children can learn all about the life cycle of those species, it really gets them engaged in caring for the river, understanding what's causing pollution and trying to bring pressure on local businesses to reduce that pollution. It's really, really powerful. But it's also really good to get the children involved in being a part of the natural environment. And the other good thing is there's so much doom and gloom and talked about with rivers, but actually it allows them to go and find small tributaries that are actually in really good condition. We do still have some rivers that are in good condition, and it's lovely to go and find them and to look under a rock and find this fantastic thriving ecosystem of insects, and it's a heartwarming thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Graham Warner has said, waiting for government industry to take action is too slow. Social change comes from the action of an individual multiplied by millions of individuals. Absolutely. Yes. Helen, though, tell us more. I mean, you're a proper scientist. You're at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory and everything. Not to say that the others aren't proper scientists, but Plymouth Marine Laboratory. I mean, what's your take on citizen science?
I think it's fantastic. I think being able to engage the public and get them involved is, like we've all said, it's a fundamental way to make people be engaged with the environment, have some love for it, and once people have some stewardship or kind of empathy or love for it, then I think they're more likely to care for it and respond to change. And we have some success stories as well with citizen science. I've done a number of projects with the British Exploring Society where they've gone up into the Arctic and taken samples for us, which we aim to publish in peer-reviewed journals. And there's a great one on at the moment with the British Antarctic Survey and WWF. If you Google walruses from space, you can go on and use the satellite data to track walruses, and the scientists are up in the Arctic at the moment actually validating the data that citizens are looking at through their computers. So there's some really great marine citizen programs, and even down to things like their chemistry, it's a lot more complicated, and obviously we want to make sure that the data we provide for kind of climate change analysis and long-term trends and that kind of thing is the most robust data that we can provide. But that's not to say there isn't a place for just getting as much information and data as we can, and we're working with engineers and things to try and find ways of producing cheap monitoring devices that we can perhaps give to schools or other foundations and things that can get people out there making their own monitoring activities that can then feed into a wider network of observations, really. So yeah, I'm all for it. I think it's a brilliant way to get people involved.
Great. I think as we get ever more sort of digital tech and so on, we'll see the citizen science actually being able to sort of be networked more, become ever more accurate, provide real-time data and so on. I think for us at the Wildlife Trust, we're very excited about the potential for citizen science in the future and how we can go through a real sort of transformation in that. Ian Townsend has said citizen science is needed to fill a huge gap in monitoring due to under-resourcing of regulators such as the Environment Agency, NRW in Wales, SEPA in Scotland, and so on. And Jade Neville has said West Country Rivers Trust have a fantastic citizen science programme for river monitoring in the southwest. Bill Foe has said hope to be working with Canal and River Trust in Walsall to carrying out water sampling regarding runoff pollution going into the canal and its impacts on plants and wildlife. So citizen science has definitely got the chat going tonight. Thank you for that. But there's another point there. Ian Townsend referred to it, and it's come up in a number of comments tonight that we're going to have to talk about a little bit. David Adelson has said, in Woodbridge in Suffolk, the town council has a programme of water testing in the river and estuary for E. coli and nitrates, working with the local university, and the results are surprisingly bad. The Environment Agency is under-resourced for prevention enforcement, though. Alison Wood has said river cleanliness from source to taps and in reverse for homes to the sewers needs more attention by all from water companies and the Environment Agency to people at home. Joe, I just want to ask you, you were at the Environment Agency for 28 years. You're now very much campaigning on this, pushing issues about the need for more action. The Environment Agency is often sort of on the receiving end of criticism for not doing enough about river and water pollution. What's your sense of it? Is it that it's the Environment Agency is under-resourced, or could it be doing more? Is there a kind of do we just not have the right kind of enforcement culture in the UK generally? What's your sense of it?
I think certainly the Environment Agency has had its resources cut progressively over the last decade or so. But what frustrates me is there are some fantastic people in the Environment Agency, passionate, capable scientists who know what to do, but they're not allowed to do it. And that frustrates me. It frustrates all of us and all of them, to be fair. So if you report a pollution incident, they're not necessarily allowed to come out and look at it because it doesn't satisfy necessary criteria. They're not allowed to do the permit reviews. I bang on about permit reviews because if permits had been reviewed for storm overflows more frequently and more effectively every time the catchment of an overflow was changed by new housing or a new factory, then those permits could have been altered to increase the amount of sewage that went forward to the sewage works and therefore to reduce the risk of increased spillages into the rivers. So there have been problems at the agency, but they're certainly not with the staff within the agency. The staff within the agency are just lovely, and I would love to see them have more money, more resources and more freedom to do what they're good at. They've recently had their lease cars taken off them, the frontline field staff, some of them, and you think, well, how can they ever do that job properly if they can't go out to a pollution incident or go out to meet a farmer or go out to inspect a sewage works? So there needs to be more focus, in my opinion, on frontline activities and less focus on spreadsheets, plans and strategies. But it's not just that. The storm overflow problem has been going on for 2 decades. It just came into the public psyche during lockdown, really, because people suddenly wanted to go to Hackney Marshes and have a barbecue or fling themselves in the River Thames at Oxford. And suddenly they were going, what do you mean it's full of sewage? How can it possibly be full of? Well, this has been going on for 20 years and it's down to primarily down to more houses being built, more businesses being commercial premises being built, roads and rail and infrastructure being built, and all that drainage going into the drainage network that simply couldn't tolerate it. So there was this sudden sort of throwing up of arms, but the problem had been evolving for a long time. So I think it's a multi-pronged problem. It's not any one person's fault or any one organisation's fault. The water companies although they are berated frequently in the press, they have done some fantastic stuff. The sewage works in this country are generally brilliant. The sewage works near me at Blackburn has just had this fantastic new Nerida treatment system built. So we you know, they really have done some fantastic stuff in the water companies in the last 20 years. They've also done some brilliant stuff to create habitats for wildlife that they don't get enough credit for. So it's unfair to beat any one organisation with a stick. It's everybody's problem and partly everybody's fault. We were all caught napping, really, and we can fix it, and they are fixing it. You know, there are huge amounts of money and time and resources being spent looking at overflows and trying to understand how to make them better. We're all looking at road runoff and seeing how to fix that. We know how to fix it. We're putting pressure on the powers to be to let us fix it. Sustainable drainage systems are getting better and better. They've started growing fruit trees in sustainable drainage systems so that small children can pick apples and pears and damsons in their local environment. So there is a massive shift to make this better and to make it better faster. And yes, we're all guilty of having been sleeping on the job to some extent for the last 20 years. So instead of beating one another up, let's just work together and fix it.
Okay, very good. You did say something fascinating there, Helen, though. You said that sorry, Joe, you said something fascinating there, which is what you said that brilliant staff and Environment Agency, which I don't doubt for a minute, doing really hard work on the ground. They want to get on with the enforcement, but often they're not allowed to. Just say a bit more about that. It just strikes me as quite a comment, really.
Well, just recently there's been coverage in the press of a change in the rules. So when a pollution incident is reported by you or me, and I might ring up and say Cockshot Brook has got milk in it, those pollution reports are categorised as a category 1, 2, 3 or 4, depending on how severe the impact on the environment is estimated to be. And they are then passed on to the environment officer for that catchment for them to deal with accordingly. But if it's not a category 1 or 2, they're not allowed to go out to it. So category 3 pollution incidents, which are little ones that cause only a little amount of harm, nobody goes to look at those. And everybody who's ever worked in environment protection will tell you that a category 3 pollution left unvisited will often turn into a category 2 or a category 1 over time. So a small oil leak becomes a big oil leak, or a milk leak out of a milk line somewhere in a milk production factory gets bigger and bigger. So by stopping environment officers going to those little, what you might see as little pollution incidents, they don't have the opportunity to stop those pollutions before they become bigger. But also they don't have that opportunity to get to know the manager of the milk production plant, or the farmer, or the chap who runs the car wash, or the lady who lives next to the outfall. And that local knowledge, that local community connection, when I used to be an environment officer all those years ago, was so powerful in learning about the river environment and improving the river environment. And unfortunately, that's got lost. And that's where the Rivers Trust and the citizen scientists fill that gap. Whether that should be the case or not, I don't know.
And I'm wondering, Helen, Sophie, do you find that the lack of enforcement around some of these issues is a problem in your area as well?
So yeah,
Go on, Helen.
Too polite. Yeah, so I think it's, once you get into the marine realm, it's quite a tricky thing, as we mentioned before, who exactly owns these things, and Brexit's causing havoc a lot at the moment with how we deal with things like the fisheries aspects and how we monitor and manage systems between the North Sea and the English Channel and various local environments. So yeah, I think there are challenges with regulation and ability to kind of go out and keep monitoring. And I kind of echo Joe's sentiments really a little bit, in that I think there's been a lot of cuts in places that aren't necessarily the right places to cut, and that's resulted in this lack of ability to kind of really understand the issues, and making us have to put on sticking plasters rather than fixing the problem at point source. And I think that's an issue for a lot of these things. For the carbon issue, we need to be stopping carbon emissions, not sticking plasters over the top to try and actually just take out the CO2 after it's been in there. We need to stop putting it in the first place. We need to reduce our plastics. We need to be thinking about the life cycle of these plastics so that they don't end up in the sewage systems or the watercourses in the first place, as well as these sticking plasters to remove the plastics once they are in those situations. And so it's kind of this life cycle thinking I think we need to get our heads around, where we've kind of almost siloed the rivers trust, the watercourses, the sewages, and the marine realms are very much, in some respects, disparately regulated and looked after, where it's actually, I think you mentioned this right at the beginning, we need to think of these as whole systems where you're going from point source flowing all the way down into the marine environment to our local rocky shores right out to the open ocean, and that is all one joined up system, and we need to make sure that we treat it as such and monitor and regulate it as such.
Absolutely. And Sophie, I bet you'd fancy a bit more enforcement and action from agencies on your coast as well at times.
Yeah, we would. And one of them at the moment is DEFRA. So although we've had many bird flu outbreaks in the past around the UK, a lot of these have been poultry based, which is kind of what DEFRA seems to be geared up to. So when the outbreak first started and we started to get reports of dead birds, trying to actually get in touch with somebody from DEFRA who knew what to do with the wild side of things. So it was always like, you must take off the carcasses from your site, but that kind of just went for if you own the birds. It doesn't actually mean that for wild birds. So it took quite a while to actually get through the information we needed before we could actually start kind of battling it. And I know there's been issues in terms of collection from the islands of their dead birds and things. So DEFRA just seemed to be really understaffed and possibly maybe not prepared for such a big outbreak in the wild bird population as maybe what they would have been for a poultry farm.
Yeah, absolutely. They do seem to be caught sort of shocked by all this a little bit without the plans in place, it would feel to me. Okay, well, look, as ever with these wildlives, we are running out of time. We're just in the last few minutes and we've got to close. It seems like you've really enjoyed it tonight. Thank you for the comments, the many, many comments about how useful you found this. Zoe Lyons says, a very informative talk, very sad at times. Good luck with the initiatives. Thank you so much for your hard work and that of other staff and volunteers. Thank you, Zoe. That's a very kind comment. Just before I wrap up, I want to remind you that it's National Marine Week, of course. Look at the Wildlife Trust website for more information on action you can take to protect our marine life and to try and turn things around and get our marine life into recovery. But I'm going to come to our panelists just for one closing sentence each, if I can. I want to ask you to invite you to think, for people watching tonight as they step away from YouTube tonight and ponder things, what's the thing that you would most like to invite them to ponder about as they step away and reflect on this discussion tonight? Helen, can I start with you?
The first one. I would say if you have the opportunity to get to the sea, go and get some vitamin C and go and experience it. And if you don't have the opportunity to actually go visit it yourselves, which many people don't, then try and follow these sort of activities online and learn as much as you can about it. There's a wealth of resources out there for how you can help and get involved, even from your desktop computer. So yeah, just get some vitamin C.
Great. By which you mean SEA? Yeah.
I do.
Fantastic. Good. Sophie, what would you like to invite people to think about as they step away tonight?
Kind of just think a little bit more about these zootopic diseases that we're seeing. Obviously, I've talked about bird flu, but if people can kind of step away and think a little bit more about what we're doing and how that's actually causing bird flu and other diseases to become more prevalent. So things like climate change, fishery pressures. So just kind of become a little bit more aware that these diseases aren't just flukes, they're a direct cause of our interactions with the environment.
Great, thank you very much. And Joe, what would you like to invite people to think about?
Slightly off topic, but if you're lucky enough to own a little bit of a garden or a backyard or a window box, then create some habitat for wildlife, something cool and dark and dank that might not attract to people, but just will attract all sorts of different species and give them somewhere to hide and somewhere to live and thrive. No pesticides, no herbicides, no plastic grass, just somewhere lovely for the wildlife to live.
Fantastic. Well, look, I want to give a huge thanks to our wonderful panel tonight. Joe Bradley, Director of Operations for Stormwater Shepherds UK, Sophie Webster, Catch My Drift Project Officer at the Northumberland Wildlife Trust, Dr. Helen Findlay, Biological Oceanographer at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, and last but very definitely not least, Dr. Tim Ferrero, Marine Biologist and Conservationist at Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. Really sorry, Tim, that the internet connection wasn't working tonight and it didn't allow you to participate. We'll sort something out. I think we're probably going to record a video with you in the next few days and try and get that on our social media or something like that so you can tell your story a little bit. So do watch out for the Wildlife Trust social media channels for more from Tim. And broadly, don't forget to follow the Wildlife Trust social media channels to keep up to date with our latest campaigns and work. Now, listen, next month, something extraordinary is happening. I won't be presenting wildlife. There will be a wildlife happening and it won't be me. It's shocking, isn't it? But one of our brilliant ambassadors will be stepping in instead while I have a break. I know, it's shocking, isn't it? So do keep an eye out for that, and there'll be information coming there. And actually, it's a really exciting one that's being planned. I'll be on holiday. I'll be a little tempted to join and heckle from in the commentary box, but I think that would be wrong. So I won't. But one of our brilliant ambassadors will be stepping into this seat, not literally in my house, but elsewhere to do that. And it's going to be a fantastic conversation. So look out for that. I am back in September, and this is very exciting. We'll be doing a wildlife live from Carlisle and the Get Cumbria Buzzing Pollinator Conference. And for the first time, how exciting is this? We're going to have a live audience as well as all of you joining us online as well. So we'll be making tickets available for people to attend in person from the Get Cumbria Buzzing Pollinator Conference towards the end of September as well. So look out for that on our social media channels if you want to come and be in the live audience in Cumbria for the next wildlife. Definitely make sure you join that if you can, as well as if you want others will still be able to join online. I mean, what could go wrong? We're sure that technically it's all going to work. should be interesting. But I want to finish tonight by thanking again our brilliant panel of Joe, Tim, Helen and Sophie. And you know, as we play out, we can just celebrate the beautiful marine environment and just how important our oceans are and how connected our land is through our streams, through our rivers, through our watercourses, out to the oceans as well. Our land and oceans all together, this brilliant, beautiful environment we call planet Earth. This really is a century where we're going to have to turn things around and put it in recovery. Thank you and good night.